Hey guys, we're going to carry on talking about approaching the opening phase of the game of chess as though aliens had come and erased all opening knowledge from your mind. So in my first video, we looked at all the options for move 1 for white. Now we're going to turn the table and we're going to look at black's first move in the game. And really the key thing here is we want to be working on principle. Okay, so let's just recap. What do we want to be doing in the opening? We want to be gaining control of these important central squares, the high ground. Ideally, the square, the F pawn next to the king as well is good. These squares are good. We want to get our minor pieces out into the board. We want to get our queen developed out into the board at some point, and then we want to get our king castle, get our king safe, engage all of our pieces, and bottom line is we want to try and, well, particularly as black, your goal is to equalize as quickly as possible in the game, but in the first few moves, your goal should be not to lose any time in development. All right, so let's start. We're going to go through, so that there are 20 possible first moves for white, and we're going to look particularly, we'll start at the most popular, at the master level, 1e4. Okay, so now at the master level, this move, c5, which those of us who have not had our memories erased by aliens might know as a Sicilian defense. Okay, now, so let's look at this move. So what's the purpose of this move? Well, primarily the purpose of this move is to prevent white from playing this. Okay, so to prevent white from gaining dominance over the center by having two advanced pawns on the fourth rank. Because if white's going to do that, we're going to snatch the pawn off. Okay, so generally well, there is no generally because we've forgotten any opening theory. Okay, so that's one idea. You want to say to white, no, you cannot do this, okay, because if you do it, I'm going to capture you. And then white will do something else. So white might bring out a knight to protect these two squares. So now, for example, if white's thinking about doing this, then black can still capture, but white can recapture now with the knight and put the knight into the center of the board. Okay. Do we recommend this for beginners? Probably not. Right? In general, the second most popular move 1 for black in response to 1e4 is 1e5. Okay, so with this, what are we doing? Okay, we're controlling two important squares, one of which is in the center 4. We're preventing this pawn from advancing any further. We are releasing our queen, we're releasing our bishop, and we are not getting in the way of the knights moving to their natural development squares of f6 and c6. Okay, now obviously white will always have the slight advantage unless you can wrest that advantage away from them, because white has the first move advantage. That's just the way it is. That's chess, and we just have to suck it up. Okay, so decent first move for black, I would say here. Let's look at some others against e4. Okay, now the third most common is e6. So what is black's idea here? So this would seem to be less favorable than e5, putting the pawn all the way up there. One reason is that it's blocking off the diagonal for this light squared bishop. Okay, so now if white goes ahead and tries to capture the complete central control, okay, black can respond by moving his queen's pawn out and contest the center. So now we have tension between white's king's pawn and black's queen's pawn. Now white may resolve that tension by exchanging, and then we've just ended up in a normal face-off kind of situation. You know, we've got two deadlock pawns in the middle of the board, and it's white to play. So relatively normal, but there's no real disadvantage there to black. Another thing white might do to resolve this tension is to push that pawn forwards. And if white does that, then a very natural move for black is to play c5 now and try and contest this central pawn with his wing pawn. So the wing files are the C and F files, okay? So your C pawn and your F pawn are wing pawns. They're the ones to either side of the two central files D and E, all right? And if you can persuade your opponent, for example, to capture there, then black can recapture with the bishop. And look at this situation. Black is suddenly really in control of this game. Black has developed a piece. White has not developed a piece. Black has 2 pawns off the mark. All white has to show for his first four moves is 1 pawn out there. So that is not very good for white. All right, so that's e6 on the first move. Okay, what else is played? c6 is played on the first move as well. Now this might look a bit unusual. Yes, it's releasing the queen, but the c pawn, remember the c pawn and the f pawn, moving these pawns does nothing to help your bishops, right? Because these are the ones right in front of your bishops. So, you know, bishops move diagonally and it doesn't allow the bishops to move out into the board. So what's the idea with this one? Well, if white just goes ahead again and pushes d4, black's idea is again to contest the center, reinforcing his offered central pawn again with a wing pawn. So here, if white takes, black can recapture, and you see now black has 2 central pawns, whereas white only has 1 central pawn, and that is potentially an advantage for black. Of course, it's still white's turn to move, okay, but that's a general idea. Again, white doesn't have to capture here. White could push the pawn forward. For example, that's been played thousands and thousands of times. White could maybe even defend the pawn with the f pawn, which is kind of slightly risky and spicy, but that tends to be what I play at the moment. So here, if black takes, white captures, and look, white now has the advantage in the center. White also has the disadvantage of that diagonal being open towards the king because Freddie has moved. Freddie the f pawn has moved. Okay, so what else does black do apart from c6? Okay, well, we have d6. This is another option. Again, if white goes for the center, black's idea could be this, for example. Now, this isn't as strong, I would say. So with d6, yeah, we've released this bishop. We haven't released this guy. He's got a pawn in his face. That's not great. But the knights are free to move. But now, if white captures on here, okay, and recaptures, boom, queen takes queen. The king, there's only one legal move now for black. Black must recapture the queen. So now black, because his king has moved, he's lost castling rights. So I would not recommend that particular kind of approach for black. Okay, so normally what happens, as we can see in the Explorer, is the next move will be knight to f6. All right, now this is kind of tempting white to push e5, but this is not good. This is not played by white. This has only been played twice at the master level on the chess.com database, okay? And the reason is, oh, I'm attacking your knight, right? So your knight's got to run away. Well, maybe it doesn't, okay? Pawn takes. And now if this pawn captures, boom. Suddenly it's white who's lost castling rights, yeah? And then simply the knight moves away and we're attacking the f2 pawn. Okay, so this is what I really want to get you thinking about, is instead of automatically playing certain moves, to go, okay, well, what are my options here? Okay, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of each option? And when you get into that habit in the first few moves, you'll probably carry on doing that and thinking in the same way in the rest of the game, and that's very, very important. Okay, so let's carry on. What else does black do against 1e4? Okay, so we've just looked at d6, I think. g6. Here's a funny one. Now, this comes into the hypermodern kind of approach, right? This is known as the modern defense, okay? And black's idea here is to fianchetto the king's bishop, probably put the knight here on f6, and so instead of trying to contest the center immediately at the start of the game, black's thinking, okay, well, I'm going to contest the center later on. I'll allow white to play that. I'm going to play this, you know, and let's say white brings out his knight. You'll probably want to play this move, okay? And there's a reason, because if you bring your knight out straight away to here, white plays e5, and look what happens. We are going to be forced to move our knight that we've just developed a second time, and it doesn't have fantastic options, so that's not a great idea. So what you probably want to do is play d6 first, and then you can go ahead with this, because if takes, you can recapture, pawn takes, trade off the queens, force this knight to undevelop itself, move a second time, and then this knight can dance away. Okay, and I think this position looks absolutely fine for black as well. So that's one option, g6, right? Going for this modern / King's Indian defense idea. Next one, d5. Okay, now some of you may know the name of this opening, but I've personally forgotten. So d5, what's the idea with this? Well, we are immediately creating tension in the middle of the board. So white has staked his claim on these squares, and now black is saying, hey, I want a piece of the center, so I'm going to challenge your pawn directly with my pawn. And if white takes, the most common move is queen recaptures, and then you might have the knight hit the queen, and then the queen will run away to there's a few options for the queen, even that one I've seen recently, you know. So the queen might run away, and white is left without a king's pawn, black is left without a queen's pawn. So far so normal, but it's a perfectly valid way to start the game. What's next? The other one, knight to f6. So this is, we saw this actually in the white opening, Alekhine's defense. Now this is actually inviting white to push this pawn a second time, all right? But you can see this move has been played, knight to f6, nearly 29,000 times at the top level. Okay, now I probably wouldn't recommend this for beginners, because you are likely to fall into this, and then the knight's going to come here, and then white will play d4, and white has got pretty good control, particularly over these dark squares, right? Not so much over the light squares, because this pawn has moved forwards. So there's no pawn guarding this, there's no pawn guarding this, right? So the light squares aren't covered, but black has pretty good control over these dark squares, and could make life a little bit difficult for black. But then the explorer is saying that the normal move now is to push this pawn here, and then the knight would come out. Okay, d takes e5 is an idea, but in general, I think it's a little bit unprincipled. We're forcing this pawn to move a second time, right? But we're also forcing our own knight to move a second time. So, yeah, you know, pays your money, takes your choice, really. So, but I probably wouldn't recommend that at the beginner level. So what else do we have? Anything else interesting? Now we're starting to get into the weeds a little bit. We've got knight to c6 is an idea. So now if, for example, white goes ahead and grabs the center, which is probably in general a good idea, then black will compete for the center and threatening to take this pawn. Okay, so if white captures now, queen takes, and look, suddenly black has two pieces out in the board, and both pieces are attacking this pawn, and the queen could give check in a couple of ways, right? So that's not bad. That's not bad for black. But yeah, I think you know, after this we're starting to get into other stuff. So like this is called Owen's defense. Apparently, I've just learned from this because I've had all my opening theory erased. And I guess the idea, yeah, fianchetto a bishop. But this is, you know, what's this doing? It's releasing one bishop. It's not in the way of the knight, but this pawn is guarding these two squares, whereas white has these two squares, and it seems kind of slow and kind of funky. Okay, shall we finish the list? A6. No, that's pointless. So again, this, moving your edge pawns, you're not controlling any more of the board. So instead of controlling this square, you're controlling this square. So what, right? All you're doing is preventing this bishop from coming out there. So do you know what? Let's forget about the rest of those ones, okay? So in general, probably for beginners, I would say play e5. Yeah, you see e4, play e5. It's perfectly good, and that will lead you to. So this is the most classical opening. Yes, the c5 is more popular at the high level, but if I show you my games then played as white. Okay, so when I play e4 as white, look. So this is in my history from about 1000 to 1500 on chess.com. e5 has been played over 2,500 times, whereas c5 only 833 times. Okay, it has to be said that black has tended to do better playing c5. Okay, but as a beginner, I would probably recommend e5. Okay, and now so we're in my games now, not the master games, and we will be black. Okay, so the most common move now that I have seen in the past, so if I play e5, most common move, knight to f3. Okay, now why is white playing that? Well, it's pretty obvious. There's a pawn in the center of the board, okay, occupying an important space and controlling some important squares, including one central square. Okay, the pawn also happens to be undefended. Therefore, let's develop a piece. That's the whole point of the opening. Develop all your pieces, okay? Another principle in your opening is that that we said you have to move one of these two pawns to release your dark squared bishop and one of these two pawns to release your light squared bishop, right? So that means that you have to move two pawns in order to get your bishops off the back rank, okay? Knights can come out anyway, that's not a problem, right? One of the rooks will probably be centralized by castling. The other rook will have to get out into the board at some point, and so will the queen, right? But you have to move two pawns in order to complete development. Now, with that in mind, you don't want to be moving more than two pawns as a beginner. That would be unprincipled. Now, unprincipled isn't necessarily bad, but when you're learning something, you need to learn the principles first, okay? So here, we've moved one pawn, which releases this guy, and so at some point, one of these two pawns should move to release this guy. Makes sense. So white has moved the knight out here to attack this pawn that's undefended. And so another thing that we're wanting to do is we're wanting to put pressure on our opponent as quickly as possible, ideally on every single move. Make your opponent have to respond to what you just did. Now, there are a few ways for black to defend against this. By far the most common is knight to c6. This move, right? So black is saying, okay, well, you've just developed a knight attacking my pawn. I'm going to take the opportunity to develop a piece, right? And control some key squares in the board, right? Like you are. And I'm protecting my pawn at the same time. Makes lots of sense. And now, white will very often bring his bishop out to here, bishop to c4. This is the most common next move that I have seen. All right. So the idea with this is it's looking at this sensitive f7 square. It's also, let's bring the bishop out. Okay, so we're looking at this square, and the knight, notice, is only 2 jumps away from that square. So let's say black just thought, okay, I'm just going to develop. I'm not going to think, I'm not going to look, I'm not going to figure it out. Then white might come in here, and now we've got a danger, right? We've got a danger that the bishop and the knight are both looking at f7. And one thing it's worth mentioning about the f-pawns at the beginning of the game is there's only one defender of that f-pawn, and it's the king. Same goes on this side. Only one defender, and it's the king, right? When you've got one defender and two attackers, you might do an attack, okay? So that's why this is a very, very common opening. Okay. So another thing that white might play is the bishop all the way out to here. And why would white do that? Well, here's why white would do that. So let's say black continues as normal, develops another knight, okay? White can now say, okay, I'm going to capture your knight. And what I'm doing here is I'm removing the defender of that pawn. So I capture the knight, black recaptures, and white goes, thank you very much, that's now my pawn. Okay, so that's the idea of that particular defense, of that approach. Okay. Another thing you might see here is d4. Okay, is that the third most common? That is the third most common, right? So d4, again, creating tension between these pawns. And now, let's say the pawn takes, you might have knight takes. And if knight takes and queen takes, then white is looking pretty good, right? We've got two knights are off the board. Both sides have lost one pawn. White has a slight advantage of having the queen in the middle of the board, but that could also work against the queen. However, there's no knight here on b8. So normally, you'd want to develop your knight and kick the queen away with tempo, which means that your opponent is now having to waste his next move with a response that he didn't really want to do. But there's no knight there, so that queen is cannot really be disturbed on the next turn. Okay, so that's, it's all ideas, so that's d4 there, and there's some other minor ones. Some people bring out the knight, and then it's probably quite natural for black to bring out the knight, and then we have all four knights out into the board, and that's an opening that probably deserves a name that could very handily remind you of what this opening is called, but we're not doing that today. Okay, so that's your kind of ideas against 1e4. So what about d4? Now, we looked at this in the first video. d4 is less common than e4, and I think one of the reasons is, yes, it kind of releases the queen, and it definitely releases this bishop, who's got a nice diagonal, but the queen can't come out this way, so the queen only has two extra squares here, whereas with e4 the queen has 1, 2, 3, 4 cool squares, and this bishop has several squares as well, right? So you've got more board control by playing the king's pawn on the first move than you do by playing the queen's pawn on the first move. Okay, and there's some responses to this. So most common, again, as we saw, right? In fact, let me change it to my games as white. Okay, so when I play d4, by far the most common, over 1,000 games, so more than half of the games, way more than half of the games, my opponent has just played d5. Okay, so white's looking at these squares, black's looking at these squares. There's it's quite peaceful right now in the board. And now what I've tended to play in the past is my bishop out to here. So I'm developing a piece. Okay. However, my bishop is looking at this pawn, which is protected by the queen. So let's see. When I've been playing black, I've tended to play. To refresh it again. Yeah, I've tended to play d5. And then my opponent will most often play c4. Again, using a wing pawn to contest the center. So saying, okay, you've got a central pawn, I'm going to try and get your wing pawn to take it. Okay? And there are several defenses to this. Black could play his king's pawn forward, but then if takes and takes, white has two central pawns, and black only has one central pawn. Another approach is to push this pawn forward. And I kind of like this one, right? This move has some advantages to it. It's defending this pawn, so if white takes, you recapture. Okay, that's okay. Another thing is, because we've moved the d pawn, there is a diagonal towards the king. White has the same problem because the queen's pawn has moved away from d2. So there is a diagonal towards the king, right? Now, pushing c6 blocks off the diagonal. Okay, another thing that it does is it's the c-pawn, so it's opening up the queen, and you might have ideas of the queen coming out maybe with check at some point. So that's another idea. Okay, so let's look at, so apart from d5, what else do we see? d6 is an option. Okay, and then say white goes e4, that's the most common thing. And then you might bring your knight out, or you might contest for the center straight away again there. But here, again, we see the same problem as we saw with a different move order, right? If you do this, okay, and pawn takes, you can't really retake because queen's going to take queen and your king loses castling rights. So that's maybe not ideal. All right, so we're back on this one. So pushing a pawn 1 can help, but you need to have an idea, why are you pushing a pawn 1 square instead of the full 2 squares? Right? When you push 2 squares, you're controlling some important squares on your opponent, in your opponent's half of the board. If you only push 1 square, you have to be conscious that you're blocking off a bishop, which is a potential liability later on down the line, but it will generally be in preparation to support something else. Yeah, another pawn coming forward a little bit further. So what else do we see? We see f5. I've played this quite a lot as well myself, and I've seen it quite a lot as well. So generally what will happen is f5 it's a bit like when white plays 1 e4 and black plays this, okay, which we saw is very common at the high level, preventing the second pawn from coming out. Okay, but this is the mirror image of that. So the d pawn comes out, the queen's pawn, and black responds with this. Why are we doing that? Well, we want to stop this idea. Okay, and then you can capture that. Now this is a tricky line that I probably don't recommend, but yeah, I wouldn't say f5 for beginners. I would say let's play principled chess. Another idea is this, but that's kind of crazy, because you're literally just giving up a pawn, right? And white will probably happily accept the pawn, and you've got nothing to show for it. So I don't think that's a good idea at all. I would say, in general, as a beginner, d4, d5, and see how the game goes, right? Keep it solid, keep it classical, keep it traditional. Yeah, there's not much else to it really, but I think this will get a lot more interesting once we start to look at some real games and look at all the logic, not just in those first couple of moves, but the first 3, 4, 5 moves. So that's what we're going to go on to next. We're going to look at some real life games and really start to look at why these first few moves are important. Now, a lot of people will play their first moves almost automatically. Okay, so for example, you've got a white player who always plays this. Okay, and I'm not going to say what it's called, right? But they think, oh, my opponent's going to play this. Pretty much whatever my opponent does, I'm okay. Okay, but recently I've started playing c5 against this move. Okay, and now if they do that, you take the pawn. Oh no. And then the queen recaptures, okay? And then your knight comes out and hits the queen, okay? And there's a threat of this pawn coming up, attacking the bishop and stuff like that as well. So you can surprise your opponent. So really, what I really want you guys to get into thinking is stop playing moves completely automatically. Even if you end up playing the same move that you would have played if you were just following some kind of opening, understand why you're playing the move. Don't just play it automatically by rote, okay? Think about the move. I mean, this looks kind of good for white, but then I've only had one game that's gone this way and I won it, all right? But now, you know, white loses time by having to move the queen again. And black has 2 central pawns and white only has 1, okay? All these things matter, all these things add up. But we'll get a lot deeper into this when we start actually analysing some openings, really step by step, and really slowing things down and thinking about the logic and the purpose behind every single move in the opening, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So hang in there, stay with us, and we'll get on to that very soon. I'll see you very soon.